Welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would sit down with one of my art and design books from my collection and kind of thumb through it and do some soft-spoken discussions about what's inside and maybe use this chopstick to trace some of what is on the page. For those who don't know, which I would assume is anyone really, I just graduated with a degree in art history, and so I have begun over the past, 5 to 8 years amassing my own little collection of art and design related books. And I am quite a sucker for not only, of course, what is discussed, the subject matter in the books, but also just like well-designed art books. I love when the quality of the book's design matches the quality of the art or design that's being discussed. But I am also someone who is maybe a procrastinator and also has, a lot of different things that capture my attention, so I'm not always the best at getting around to each of the books that I add to my collection. I also tend to buy them faster than I can give them proper attention. So I thought maybe not only would it be nice to kind of share this with you, but I could maybe make this a series and it will also help me appreciate my own books. I haven't done this in any of my previous videos, but I'm going to be chewing gum, so let me know if that is something you guys like or not. But yeah, this book in particular is a compilation of works that were included in the Domus magazine during the 1970s. For those who aren't aware, as you can see here, Domus I'm not sure if they're still in publication, a monthly magazine of architecture, design, and art. I just thought this would be a nice one to take a look at. I'm pretty sure Taschen, makes a lot of art and design related books, really, nice publications. This one I think I got during one of their sales, where you can get like discounts for slightly like imperfect copies. As you can see, the corners are kind of bent and whatever, but like I don't really mind too much. The book is kind of meant to be, used, and their books, as with all good art books, can be quite expensive, so I will take the deal whenever I can get it. But I say all that to say that I'm pretty sure they have other compilations for other decades, but this is the only one that I own so far. But I think the 1970s, you can really say this about any decade, but there was a lot of great and interesting design developments going on. This is kind of like a transitionary period where, around 1970 is kind of the tail end of mid-century, what we call mid-century modern nowadays. That was kind of like, mid-1940s until 1970. And that had started to run its course, and we were kind of looking towards new ideas, and this is when postmodernism and its influences start creeping in. So I think there's actually, let me see. Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's actually a blurb on the inside cover that I thought I could read just for a little more context before we look at some of the stuff in here. Individuality and ecological awareness. This fresh reprint of Domus's 1970s coverage brings together the most important features from an era marking seismic changes in architecture and design. It was a time when individualism gained momentum as a novel style, and we began to notice the first postmodernist tendencies. Faced with the global energy crisis, architects and designers imbued their methods with a new ecological awareness. For work to be featured in the magazine, it had to offer function, spatial clarity, intellectual persuasion, relevant originality, and grace. The groundbreaking projects and practitioners that made the cut include Shiro Kuramata, Bernard Panton, Joe Colombo, Richard Meyer, The Modernist Structures by Foster Associates, and the Center Georges Pompidou by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. Speaking of the Pompidou Center, that's actually, it's kind of cliche to say, but it really is one of my favorite buildings. It's just so beautiful to me. And I'm kind of sad to hear about how they're reworking it currently. I think it just closed semi-recently for like really big renovations and like restructuring, and it's kind of sad to see. And then about the series, the quintessential works of modernism. For nearly a century, Domus has been the world's most influential architecture and design journal. Founded in 1928 by the great Milanese architect Gio Ponti, it has consistently highlighted the characteristic styles of each age, from Art Deco, modernism, functionalism, to pop, postmodernism, and late modern. Beautifully designed and documented, Domus presents the most exciting projects from around the world. Each volume of Taschen's Domus reprint collection reproduces a selection of the magazine's original pages, packed with articles tracing the history of modern design and architecture. Available as 7 separate volumes covering 1928 to 1999, this series is a must-have item for design and architecture institutions and practices, architects, designers, students, and anyone who loves design. So yeah, as I mentioned, it seems to be that there are 7 different volumes, and this is the one covering the 1970s. Just to keep the book open, I'm going to flip to a random point close to the middle, so I don't have to keep, holding the side back. And it looks like we have open to, yes, a work by Louis Kahn in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I'm going to skip to the front of it. Yes, the Capitol buildings for Dhaka. I've seen this project before, and I'm familiar with a lot of other Louis Kahn works. There's, I think, I'm trying to remember the name, but there's a documentary that his son made about him that I've been meaning to watch. Kind of talking about growing up with his dad as this kind of star architect. And obviously any creative who's so dedicated to their work and stuff, the balance between that and family can be difficult. So I'm very curious to see that documentary. But I actually just bought another art book when I visited the Yale Center for British Art, which Louis Kahn also designed. But so we're currently halfway through. I assume this book is organized chronologically, but we're in July 1975. And this is the National Assembly Building in Dhaka, Bangladesh. If you're unfamiliar with Louis Kahn's work, I would say that these large geometric forms and like cutouts throughout the building are very emblematic of his work. He works with these like simple geometries, but in like monolithic scale. And there's a lot of beautiful rhythm. as you can see, this is kind of emblematic of how design was evolving away from mid-century modernism into postmodernism, where they're kind of abandoning some of the ideals of modernism that were a little more rigid regarding form, adhering to functionality strictly. Obviously, a lot of this still has to do with, all architecture has to do with functionality, and the form has to follow that in some way, but, obviously these large geometric portals are not necessarily associated with function. Obviously they do serve a function by bringing air and light into these spaces, but their design with these grand geometric shapes is not necessary to the building or its function. So things are getting a little more kooky, you might say. I like this seems to be an interview of some kind on the side. Does it say anywhere? No. But obviously it seems to be two people talking back and forth. Obviously I don't speak Italian, but I also love these, monolithic forms, geometric forms, and curves being made out of brick. I find that very beautiful. Taking this rigidly square, rectangular unit and manipulating it into these curving forms. And the contrast between shadow and light is very beautiful. Notice it says translation, see page 618. Just take a peek. Yes, it seems to be. It is interesting that those photographs were while the work was in progress, but they extracted a talk arranged for Domus between two of Kant's friends and collaborators, Richard Saltworm and Henry Wilcox, who is the W. I also start seeing a lot of these, I don't want to speak out of turn, because this is not my area of expertise or anything, but not that I really have one, but these more kind of moving towards a futurist, some designers, obviously it's not a all-encompassing thing, but you see some designers moving towards these share a lot of similar elements with mid-century modern design, but we're kind of introducing more bright colors and kind of a lot more plastic. Yeah, fiberglass wall elements. I guess I'm not entirely clear if is fiberglass plastic. I guess a kind of plastic. Wow. I think we also around this time. This is giant grit shell in Mannheim, a pavilion for the Flower and Garden Show in Mannheim, Germany. But I think we start seeing a lot more of this, like, I believe the word is parametric design. With like these kind of complex curves and stuff that like you couldn't, I mean you probably could, but like no one was doing by hand. Because I'm pretty sure that this is like around the time that computer-aided design became a thing. Don't take my word for that, but I mean, from these pictures, I would assume that these are like computer generated, and that really like opened the doors for a lot of new ways of approaching design and architecture. Again, I'm not for sure on the time frame, but I know that originally like CAD programs, I think it started with CATIA, which was I don't know if it was made by or for the U.S. government to aid in like plane design, like designing aircraft, I'm pretty sure. And then the field of architecture got their hands on that, and obviously other programs popped up and stuff, but they started utilizing CAD programs in the design process, which allowed for these crazy, complex systems that opened up, once again, increasing how much interior space you could have without any supports interrupting the space. This whole thing is like supporting itself. So you can have these giant open spaces without any columns coming down. That's quite striking. And you still see plenty of the influence of this kind of stuff today. I mean, these kind of organic, amorphous, like curving blob shapes are kind of, more popular than ever. Looking at like Zaha Hadid and those kind of firms. Seeing more of this like Italian futurist-ish interior design. A lot of this is like a very particular shade of orangey red that I feel like you see very popular at this time. I wonder, I'd be curious to know if that was maybe a result of like manufacturing, like maybe this was like a particular pigment that, worked well with this new material or something. I'm not sure why like this particular color was so prolific. This interesting mirror. This feels very like 2020 to me. Like everyone, like 2020 to 2022, everyone wanted these like, I'm tired of rectangular, boring mirrors. I want like a fun, funky mirror. And people were doing those like, to me, hideous mirrors that they like use that spray foam that like you spray it and it expands, and they were like spraying it in amorphous shapes around the edge, and they always looked really terrible to me. But yeah, I'm glad people were having fun. Funnily enough, I've seen pictures of, they did, okay, this was the facade of one of the showrooms for Best Product Company. And I guess at this time, it doesn't really talk about it here, but there were several of these. This was, a chain store. I'm actually not even sure what they sold, but at the time, it was just like any other big box store, and all the stores were plain rectangles, and they invited I want to say 8 different designers or designing groups to transform 8 different showrooms that they had in their own unique way, and disrupt the traditional rectangular prism of the store. And this is one of them by James Wines and Emilio Sousa of Sight Inc. And they made it look like the building was crumbling with all these bricks falling on top of this awning. And I assume the real top of the building is here. And so they built up a faux wall that goes up higher than the actual height of the building, so that they could have this kind of eroded edge. It's quite interesting. I know there's another one that the facade is tilted forward. It's cantilevered, or not cantilevered, it's canted. So it's no longer a perfectly vertical plane. But pictures of this series, I guess, have been circulating online recently. I know I've seen them at least twice in the past 6 months. So it's funny that I came across it in here. I feel obviously during mid-century as well, I guess really all of the 20th century, there was such an emphasis on furniture design. So much of the most iconic designs that are very indicative of each respective era were chairs. Of course, mid-century modern, there's the Eames chair and Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona chair for the Barcelona Pavilion, etc., etc. And you just don't see that nowadays, like, at all, really. I mean, I'm sure there are still, great designers out there working on stuff, but I can't think of the last, like, iconic chair. This is a great cover. Something I always love about Domus covers is they pretty much always nail the color that they choose for the type. I love this bright orange complementing all the blue hues. And of course, plucked from the kid's shirt, so it's still tied in to the actual image. But yeah, this kind of structure, this like paneled, distorted grid feels very of the time. I mean, this kind of like, same with what I was talking about of like parametric stuff and like using, I'm struggling to think of the word, but like, these kind of alternative grid structures goes back, much further than the 70s, but I feel like they were really having a moment at this time, particularly as we looked at like new materials and, like I said in the blurb, considering things like sustainability and whatnot. But I mean, like, I think the earliest kinds of this, not like this exact kind, but what I'm describing, go back to like Russian, like early 1900s Russian artists and architects, and like I'm thinking of like Tomlin with like Tomlin's Tower, and stuff like that. I can't remember if it was Tomlin or someone else who did like the very first one. I know I've like seen a picture of it, and it's like this kind of silly looking tower in like some small city in, I think, Russia or Eastern Europe somewhere. But obviously that, paved the way for a lot of different stuff, including what we see here. This is a really beautiful shot. I think the contrast of this, like, this structure is blending very rigid shapes with more organic curves. I don't want to say unnatural shapes because, I mean, hexagons and stuff like that are found all over nature. Because, I mean, clearly this looks like a honeycomb or something like that. But not organic like this is, where it's completely irregular. So I really enjoy the contrast between these two. But they have similar color and hue, and like value to one another. And then obviously the material is entirely unnatural. sort of playfulness to this that we were really seeing with like mid-century modern stuff. I feel like I could spend an hour on this one just finding new paths to trace. But it is beautiful in a way. It almost becomes like mandala-esque with the geometries and like the unending ways that your eye can travel around the space. I could definitely imagine being a kid and having a lot of fun in this play structure. Oh, this is actually in Aspen, Colorado. Something about this feels very European, so I was assuming that this was like, I don't know, maybe near the Alps or something, but one thing I will say about a lot of architecture from this time is a lot of the forms are quite beautiful, but, and maybe this is just because I'm younger, so I never experienced these in their heyday when they were like the new, cutting edge, the most futuristic. They've always obviously appeared as dated to me because I, am looking at them in hindsight only. But whereas like mid-century modern had, I think, very beautiful material expression. A lot of the materials in some of these works from like 70s and 80s, the material choices are like not very beautiful to me. Like I feel like I see a lot of this like kind of tan beige. I assume it's concrete. I'm not entirely sure, but it's just not very appealing to my eyes. And that's coming from someone who's like a big visual fan of like brutalism and exposed plain concrete. But it's kind of like tan beige. It just feels very like municipal and like, I don't know. That makes me feel like I'm at like a kind of rundown public pool or something. I don't know. Beautiful covers. But maybe you can see what I mean about their use of color in their logo. It always feels like a carefully considered counterpoint or like balancing element to whatever else is happening. I mean, obviously it can't always always be like super, what's the word, like in this one, there's not much to go off with this, as it's just a black and white schematic. So like, in a way, the color doesn't really matter. Like any color is gonna pop or, stand out because there's nothing to go off of. But in a lot of these, taking the highlight color that is like not not super common in the image, but stands out a lot. Same here, taking this kind of purpley pink hue, or just something that is not really present but would complement what's in the picture. Like here, this kind of chartreuse color isn't really present anywhere in the picture, but I think it goes well with this blue-green and these like blue hues, and then this red. These are so striking. This is also around the time of, these are by Ziggurat, which I'm pretty sure is an Italian architectural group, but I don't think they were necessarily working together, but they were working around the same time and in a lot of the same ways as groups like Archigram. Like all of these architectural groups were kind of playing with this idea of architectural rendering and like pushing it past its limits. Like obviously these are kind of nonsensical in a way. Like these are not literal plans for urban planning proposal, but they like were almost more thought exercises that kind of pushed the limits of what architecture could be. I know they're kind of controversial in a way because some people find them pointless, or like this does not contribute anything material to architecture. But I mean, just for their visuals alone, I find them very beautiful. They're almost like a collage work that is kind of appropriating the visual language of architectural schematics. But I do think they contributed something to the field as a whole and how architects approach design and thought about spaces. And a lot of this work is also inspired by like the metabolist movement, especially in Japan. And like, thinking about, I can't remember exactly which architect it was, but his master plan for the Tokyo Bay and like these superstructures that would like, span entire cities and stuff. I find all of that very, very fascinating. And funnily enough, I don't remember his dad's name, but one of the founders of Archigram, his son is A.G. Cook, which, if you're into pop music, you may know him. He's a producer who releases plenty of his own music, but he also collaborates with a lot of people, especially in the kind of like hyperpop and hyperpop adjacent spaces, so like Charlie XCX, almost kind of feel like three-dimensional. Okay, well, they're obviously three-dimensional in a way, but they're still kind of flat in the sense that there's no like coherent sense of like space and depth. Like, this does not make sense as a singular space. You know, you have like section drawings, and then they're also receding, but like receding in different directions, etc. But there's still, each individual element has depth to it, and in that way, these feel kind of like three-dimensional successors to like Russian constructivism, and the way that they were playing with geometry. You know, thinking about like Malevich, and works like that, or artists like that, and this is so beautiful. I love architectural photography, especially these kinds of detail shots that like really reduce the structure into its like formal qualities. And by like disorienting you from the context, you can appreciate them just on a formal level. They almost become like abstract paintings. But I've always been very attracted to the formal qualities of like infrastructure, things that like aren't necessarily built to be beautiful. I mean, obviously, something like this was, because they understood that, you know, things can be infrastructure and they can be functional and they can use, you know, exposed materials, and it can still be beautiful. But a lot of, I'm thinking of like early 1900s, there are a lot of like artists who were exploring new urbanized or industrial structures in their works, and highlighting that even though that these structures were built pretty much purely for functional use, like grain elevators, etc., they're still beautiful in a way, and they still have their own sense of, you know, proportion and rhythm, and they were something new, and then that was, I think, very interesting to them, because obviously everything from the natural world has been, you know, extensively portrayed in art, and so to have these kinds of a new typology to play with through formal expression was exciting to those artists. One of my favorite paintings of all time is My Egypt by Charles Demuth, which is a part of what I'm describing, and it's I think it's an American precisionist style, and it is capturing this grain elevator in, I believe it's Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, at least for part of his life. And yeah, for all the reasons I just talked about, I find it very beautiful, but I also find it quite beautiful. I think the name kind of alludes to this grain elevator, and if you want to look up the painting, you can see it's like from a perspective very far below, so that the vertical lines are, it's in three-point, well, it's kind of a three-point perspective, so that the vertical lines would converge to a point rather than being parallel. And because of that, it kind of reinforces the name's allusion to Egypt and makes you think of the pyramids. So I think in a way the name kind of alludes to this, simple, unassuming grain elevator in kind of, middle of nowhere Pennsylvania that like no one would really think twice about, or like most people probably wouldn't consider beautiful, but in a way that was like his pyramid of Giza, like that was his monument that he, looked at growing up, or was part of his landscape. And I think there's something very beautiful about, being observant and appreciative of the beauty around you. And, people today like to kind of talk about like romanticizing your own life, and sometimes all that, social media talk can kind of come off cringe to me, but there is a truth to that. And I think that that's something that painting speaks to. I've never seen this building before, but it's very striking. The combination of forms, and this shot in particular, is very beautiful. Wow. I love the use of color in these schematics. It's gorgeous. I feel like in this period where they were kind of, whereas like what we call mid-century modern now was a lot of like kind of trying to go back to basic elements, and like abandon everything, because mid-century modern, as I mentioned, started in the mid-40s, and obviously that was right after World War II ended. And so coming out of, the first half of the 1900s and the two world wars, with all of this, social change, technological change, the lasting effects of the wars, etc., I think many artists had a great impetus to kind of abandon everything traditional about art, design, etc., and try to kind of like reinvent it from basic principles, which is, why we see modern architecture go back to these, simple geometries, plain expression of material, etc. And then I feel like coming into this period, they're still taking, what they think works or worked in that time, but also like re-examining, maybe there was some stuff that we threw away that wasn't, entirely bad, or that could be useful, or could be reintroduced. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we get a lot of kind of like interesting fusions of styles and periods, really, or like period influences from different periods. once again, plenty of chairs. Yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about earlier with these hypothetical and unbuilt architectural renderings that a lot of different people are working on, like Paul Rudolph, particularly with these like superstructures. Like this is like a giant structure that spans like the entire city, and it has like a highway underneath, and then above it are these housing units and like office spaces, and like trying to kind of incorporate everything into one fabric. Obviously something like this never got made, but I think it was still greatly influential, not to mention like visually beautiful. I think unfortunately kind of the closest we are coming or have come to something like this is the line that they're working on in Saudi Arabia right now, which is a monstrosity, but you can't say that this stuff wasn't influential in some way. I love old architectural models. I switched around a lot. My major in college, and before I was in art history, I did like 3.5 semesters of architecture. So I definitely know the pain and tribulations that go into making an architectural model. And obviously I never made anything to this like level of quality or complexity, but even the stuff that we were making in our studio was PTSD inducing, and tears were indeed shed, which is not something that is very usual for me. But I remember specifically one project. They just gave us too short of a deadline. Like pretty much everyone in the studio agreed that like there was no way any of us were going to finish our models in time, and we had been there all night, and like class was about to start in like 2 hours, and I knew at that point that I was not going to finish my model before class, and I was exhausted and just, you know, no sleep, no, probably not eating at all, like got to me. And I was talking to one of my professors who like kind of pulled me aside, and I just started like sobbing in front of him, and he like, thankfully, you know, our professors were not, they had tough love, you know, because they're trying to mold you into, you know, better architects, whatever. And it's a very hard profession, so they have to have high expectations and really push you, etc., etc. But in that moment, he was, you know, very comforting, and he was like, "You're doing good work, blah blah blah. Just go home." Like he was like, "Don't worry about class today. Like, go to your dorm and get some sleep." And I was like, "Thank you." Like wiping away my tears. Like, "I'm sorry. Thank you." In that moment, I was very appreciative of his understanding. But I can't say that certainly contributed. Maybe this is where I'll end off for today, back on Louis Kahn. I'm very, this is his art museum in Fort Worth, Texas, the Kimball, and it's a very famous, pretty much world-renowned museum, and I'm very upset that I didn't get to visit it before I moved out of that area. I grew up in Oklahoma, and 3 years ago, me and my family moved to Connecticut, and obviously now I'm much further away, so it'd be much harder to visit, so I kick myself for not having visited before we left. Similarly, I don't feel quite as strongly about it, but I feel kind of similar for not visiting Crystal Bridges in Arkansas. I mean, I think that one was even closer to me than this one was, but yes, I was going to say, I hope there's some pictures of the interior. The lighting is like probably the most salient feature of this building. Maybe it talks about it here, but kind of. I mean, it's talking about the lighting, but not particularly what I was thinking of. I remember seeing a video of him explaining this building. Maybe it wasn't him, or maybe it was another architect just talking about the building, but I'm pretty sure it was him. And like explaining how these, so like, as you can see from this section, the building has these domed, it's like sectioned off into these domed units, and each one of them has an opening at the top to let light in. But obviously museums are you have to be very careful with light, especially natural light, in order to protect the art inside, but also you have to be able to see the art and like see it properly. So it's always a hard thing to juggle with museums and lighting. So the way that it was done in this museum was having this opening, and then underneath each opening are these structures that bounce the light up onto these curved ceilings to diffuse it down into the space below without it being direct light. And I think he's talked a lot about like there's a lot of like science behind the like different kinds of light, and like white light versus yada yada, and like the direction the sun comes from throughout the year at this location in Fort Worth. And there was like a lot of extensive thought put into it to like get the perfect lighting environment. And clearly it paid off, because I think this is a very widely celebrated building and museum. But yeah, I always love the intersection of like I don't know, quote unquote fine art and like museums and stuff, and then architecture, and how do we, address the unique and delicate needs of what's being stored inside these buildings, and then also balancing that with being able to, have a pleasant space to interact with and move through, and being able to see the artwork, etc. Makes me think of another one of my favorite buildings, which is down on the Yale campus, and it's the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which was designed by Gordon Bunshaft for, I think, SOM, which is a huge firm that has done like so many huge projects. But of course, being a repository for like rare books and manuscripts, there really can't be any direct natural light coming into the building, as that would, damage the contents. And so you have this like big, heavy-looking rectangular prism-shaped building made out of like, I think, granite or like some heavy stone and then marble. But the facade is segmented into a grid, and each square in the grid has a sheet of marble that is like only a few centimeters thick, and so that when you're inside the building, some of the light passes through the marble, and like it really looks like it's like glowing. Like when you're inside, it looks like the walls are glowing from the light that can pass through, and like it shines through the veins in the marble in a very gorgeous way. But then also you have this very heavy looking building, but on the bottom floor, the bottom floor is brought in toward the center of the building by like, I don't know, 8 or 10 feet all the way around the perimeter. And that's where you enter, so that not only adds shade and covering to the entrance, so that there's not a lot of natural light coming in through the entrance into the building, but it also kind of makes the building look like it's floating. And then on each corner of the building, there are these giant like piers, like feet, that make it look like the building is like, this very heavy building is delicately resting on these four contact points with these feet, when in reality, the core of the building is what's mostly holding it up. But it kind of creates this elegant visual illusion in a way. So definitely look up that building and check that out. I think I'm going to call it here, though. I kind of intended this video to be a shorter one than my other ones, but it seems to be a running theme that I just kind of ramble indefinitely, and before I know it, an hour and a half has gone by. But I hope you enjoyed my ramblings and musings about some of this beautiful and influential design and architecture. And if you enjoyed it, definitely let me know if I should make this a series. I have, I could continue looking at this one, but I also have plenty of other art and design related books to explore. But I hope you enjoyed and got some relaxation. Definitely like and subscribe and comment and yada yada yada. And I'll see you guys next time.